I was born in Breslau, Germany, and you can't find that on the map anymore because after World War II, that became Wrocław, Poland. And it was a well-to-do middle-class family that I came into in 1925. My father had a sporting goods store, and that is what made the money for us. And as a typical middle-class family, there was a live-in maid, and when I came along, they hired a girl to take care of me. My mother's sister's husband was accosted on the street by a bunch of brown-shirted Nazis before Hitler came to power, and they found out he was Jewish, and they killed him. And there was not much that was done after that. So now kids aren't told about things like that, but they overhear the adults talking, and they make their own decisions as to what they were hearing. And one thing that I understood was that Nazis were dangerous, and that was reinforced, as a matter of fact. When I looked out of the window of my apartment, across the street was a finance office, and that seemed to pull demonstrators. And there were communists and Nazis who were having fights in front of that office. And my parents did tell me then that neither the Nazis nor the communists are going to be much of our friends. So I understood Nazi business rather early in my life. My second grade teacher, now he came in, he was a young, energetic fella, and I could tell he liked me the way things went in the classroom. And I had my hand up often, and he called on me. And then I heard that he would come back in our third grade class. And I was all excited because I hadn't seen him for quite a while during the vacation period. And when he came in, though, he came in full Nazi uniform. And my heart just sank. I was really distraught about that. And certainly things turned out to be different now. The Hitler songs were to be sung by the kids in the class. They all had to stand up. But me, I was told to stay seated because I was not allowed to sing those songs. I was a Jew. And, of course, kid who's seated while everybody else stands is not going to be a popular kid. And I was outcast, more or less. But I will give him credit, he didn't let them pick on me. I guess he wanted order in the class. And everything was fine inside the class, but outside I was harassed, and I was chased one time, but I was a pretty good runner, and I was able to evade them. And I got home, and I told my parents, and they said, well, we'll have to do something about it. And they transferred me from the public school to a Jewish private school. There were brown shirts demonstrating in front of my father's store, don't buy from Jews. And my father understood that this was going to be a losing proposition. Germany passed laws in 1935 that segregated the Jews from the Aryans. And kids were not allowed in public school with the Aryan kids. And we had to let go of our maid because she was a German, and Germans were not allowed to work for Jews. So that was the end of Berta, because she was actually my second mother. She always took care of me. There was one incident I might tell you about. Apparently, Hitler came to Breslau, and she wanted to see Hitler. And she told me to keep my mouth shut, but to come with her. And I did. And then she instructed me that when Hitler came by, you had to raise your hand in a Hitler salute. And I said, I'm not allowed to do that. I'm Jewish. She said, you just do exactly what I tell you. You raise your hand. And Hitler came in his convertible, and smiling both sides of the street, and everybody went wild, yelling, "Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil!" And everybody had their hand up in the Hitler salute, and I had my hand up in the Hitler salute. And I was real concerned because I was afraid some of the kids from my prior class might see me and turn me in. But I was lucky nobody saw me. But I was very disappointed in Bertha because she, like everybody else, was yelling like mad, "Sieg Heil," and I couldn't understand why she would love somebody who definitely was hating me. Things tightened up more and more, and we got separated more and more. And I was told anytime if I was on the street, and particularly with my parents, they said, "Behave, behave, behave. Don't ever make a scene. Don't make any embarrassments. Don't become obvious to the outside. You just stay in the background and behave." And then things tightened up more, and we couldn't even go to any more restaurants because they had signs that said "Jews not desired," or even harsher, "Jews prohibited." And I recognized we had no connection with the Germans anymore, and Germany was a place that I was not really wanted. Now, on the other hand, within the Jewish community, I had a very comfortable life. I was on a soccer team, and when my 13th birthday, my bar mitzvah came along, I received a BMW bicycle. And I don't know how many pen and pencil sets, could never use, and various other nice presents. And I had my stamp collection, and and all these friends of mine, I was very comfortable. But my father, as I indicated, was running out of money. And right after my bar mitzvah in 1938, he turned to me and he said, "We have to do something else. I have to go to the States to see if I could find my distant relatives there so that they could give me an affidavit." He got himself a visa, a visitor's visa, and with that, he could make all kinds of arrangements ahead of time, but all he could take along was one suitcase and 10 marks. So obviously, when he got to the States, somebody had to help him out, and he was at the mercy of the Jewish relief organizations. Well, he wrote us back that he found his relatives, but the problem was that there was a depression in the States, and they didn't have the money to sign an affidavit. An affidavit is a document where the one who offers the affidavit, he has to assure that the person that he gives the affidavit to will not become a burden to the government. And you have to have money if you're going to do that, and they didn't have the money. So he thought that was a catastrophe, but it was a lucky thing because he stayed longer to find somebody who might give him an affidavit. And while he stayed longer, 2 Gestapo agents came to our door looking for him. And my mother told them that he's on an international business trip. And they said, well, the minute he comes back, he has to report to Gestapo headquarters. Well, that sort of raised a red light in our brains because both of us remember a business acquaintance of my father who had been told to report to Gestapo headquarters. And a few hours later, they found him on the sidewalk in front of the headquarters. He had either jumped or been pushed out of a third-store window. So this came to mind, and my mother immediately wrote to my father in some fashion because she was afraid that mail might be monitored, that he shouldn't come back. And 2 days later, a British lady came to our door with a document that said from the government that we had to provide her with a bedroom. Well, she was obviously a Gestapo informant. But she was basically very nice, and she indeed was British. And she gave me 2 British lessons. And that proved more valuable than she knew and that even I knew at the time. But my mother had told me when she came in, now be careful what you say in the apartment. If we have any discussions, we have to go on a walk outside. Well, one day she invited me to go for a walk, and I knew there was something important was going to be said. And sure enough, and she turned to me and said, "Should we go?" Well, I immediately knew what she was talking about. And now this was not an easy question for me because, as I indicated, I had a nice, easy life, even though outside it wasn't easy, but inside I had all my friends and everything was honky-dory. But the smartest thing I ever did in my life, I said, let's go. Because 13-year-old kid can really provide a lot of problems if he doesn't want to go, and he could talk the mother out of going by disgust. And I'm not going. But no, I had been smart enough. I knew I wasn't wanted there, and I should get the heck out of there. Anyway, the next morning at 5 in the morning, we snuck out of the apartment so that Mrs. Griffith, our British lady in there, wouldn't hear us. And my mother had done the same thing my father did. She made all kinds of arrangements. She gave us a first-class passage on American, on a Holland-American line on the Statendam, the steamer that was going to be at the bottom of the Rotterdam harbor after the first day of the war, when Germany moved into Holland. Anyway, here we were going to be on a first-class passage. And she made hotel reservations in New York for a couple of weeks and some other arrangements. And we got on a train to Berlin, where she said goodbye to her father, who died in a concentration camp some years later, and to her oldest sister. And she was able to escape to Australia with her family, but she never saw either her father or her sister again because of the distances involved. We got on our boat in Rotterdam, and we had a wonderful voyage. I enjoyed it immensely. I almost was ping pong champion, but somebody beat me. But my mother didn't have a good voyage because she was really worried about Ellis Island. She knew if you get to Ellis Island, they would interrogate, and if they should find out that my father was already in country, we would be not visitors but refugees and be placed on a next boat back to Germany because the country didn't want any refugees if they could avoid it. Well, but as chance would have it, first-class passengers, when we arrived in New York, were invited to go right onto the dock after customs. Everybody else went to Ellis Island. My gym teacher had a session with us to explain his visit to New York, and he said, "Well, when you get near the harbor, you get in front of the boat there, and if you got a camera, you take pictures because you're going to see the skyscrapers and you're going to see the Statue of Liberty." And he explained what the Statue of Liberty meant. And then when you get into New York, you go to a Horn and Hearted restaurant. And it's going to be amazing because this is a restaurant where nobody serves you. They have little windows that you look through, and each little compartment has this window, and you can choose through the window what you want to get, soup, an entree, a dessert. All you need is some coins, some nickels, some dimes, and you put them in, and the door opens, and you get your food. Of course, I wanted to see that the minute I got to New York, but I was impressed with the skyscrapers and the Statue of Liberty, and I took my pictures, and then I told my father after we met them, you have to take me to Horn and Hardart, and he knew what I was talking about, and of course he did. And we had a happy reunion with my father, of course. But when my father started to talk to my mother, he indicated, well, we're all at the mercy of the relief organizations. And they told me that the timing is finite. Eventually, we would have to go back to Germany. Well, that really concerned them. But as chance would have it again, luck was with us. And in a sense, it was a terrible luck because we ended up in New York on the 30th of October, 1938. On the 9th of November, 10 days later, it was Crystal Night. That was the pogrom action that the Germans took against the Jews in retribution, supposedly, because a French Jewish student had assassinated a member of the German embassy in Paris. And they had burned all the synagogues. They imprisoned all the men they could get their holds of. And they smashed out all the windows of the Jewish stores that were still operating in Germany. And then they imposed a large fine to repair all the damage that they had sustained, and the Jews had to pay for that. And we were very concerned about all our relatives in Germany. But this action hit the news all over the world. Everybody knew about it. And President Roosevelt issued an executive order that nobody in country would be forced to get back to Germany. That's when we were saved. Now, my father had gotten a room in a sublet, one room from a Greek family on Broadway near 141st Street on the west side. Yeah. And it was a very nice Greek family of a widow with 3 kids. The boy was about my age, the girl was a little bit younger, and then there was a younger kid about 7 years old or so. But again, I was still an outcast. I mean, I didn't speak much English, and what the kids didn't want to play with me if I couldn't talk to them, except the youngest one, he was willing to play. So that's who I had my conversations with hands and feet and whatever. And they were working for the Greek War Relief at the time and were painting little Greek soldiers with skirts. And I remember I helped paint the skirts red. And we were sitting there. And they were very nice to us. And she had a brother who came by every day just about. And he took my father to a bar. My father never went to a bar, but he didn't want to insult him, so he went along. And then at the end of the evening, he paid. And then when the cash came, after he gave his tip, he left the cash on the table and walked off. And then my father gathered the cash and ran after him and said, "You forgot the money, you forgot the money." And, well as she could, because he didn't speak English either. And the brother-in-law had waved him off and said, no, that's not my money, that's not my... He wanted to give him some money, and he didn't want to embarrass him. And that's how nice they were, really nice. And we stayed with them until almost 6 months later, when my father finally got permission to work. And when he went to work, then we were able to move to a better apartment. There was a transitional period when we were learning English. And it happened immediately for me because I went into the seventh grade. I had left the seventh grade. I went into the seventh grade. And on the first or second day, the teacher turned to me and said, "Take the waste paper basket around and collect the trash." And I couldn't understand a single word she said, but she was looking at the window. I said, she wants me to open the window. And I opened the window, and of course, all the kids are laughing. Well, a kid doesn't want to be laughed at, so I knew I had to learn English quickly. And the teachers were helpful. They gave me magazines that they marked up with explaining this is a table, this is a chair, and put the words under it. But you can't really learn language that way. So I turned on the radio. Now, the radio is difficult because you really didn't know what the story is. But the one thing it did was it gave me the intonation of the English language. So I could get rid of that, or I would never have to have that German accent, which I hated immediately. And but what really helped me was the movies. The movies was 10 cents, which was a lot of money in those days. But I went to the movies as much as I could, and that's where I really picked up the language. And with the radio and the movies and the teachers and the other kids, it was about a 6 month period when I was still pretty hazardous. But after that, it went much better. But I was still not a favorite kid in there, but I was still a bit of an outcast. And that being an outcast really impacts on you. It makes you shy, if nothing else. And I was a pretty shy kid there for many, many years. And that carried over into adulthood in the beginning. In high school, 16, some kid came running up the street. I was outside. It was a nice, cold summer morning, and the sun was shining. And the kid said, "The Japs just bombed Pearl Harbor." Pearl Harbor, what's Pearl Harbor? Well, we had to look it up. Wow, Hawaii. And then we realized the war was on, and then Germany got in the war. And in a sense, I was happy because I knew now that we were in the war with Germany. Germany was going to lose because there's no way we were going to lose. We were going to be winning. But the war was not really affecting me much. Well, it didn't take too long before I realized, whoops, this war is going to last, and I'm going to be involved in it. And, I thought I owed the country something, and they had air raid wardens. And, of course, I was too young for an air raid warden at 16, 17. But I volunteered to be a messenger. And I must have been a pretty good messenger because I was first a block messenger, then I went up to the sector, then I went up to the zone, into the police precinct, and I was learning things that I didn't know I could do, like the street lamps. How do you extinguish a street lamp? And I found out how to do that because of blackout situations. And my 18th birthday was in August. And just before that, I had, in May, graduated from high school, and I figured I'd at least take a summer course of college. And I did. I had ROTC that I took. And sure enough, in September, 1 month after my birthday, I got my draft notice. On 15 September, I was in the Army. I went to Fort Dix, New Jersey, which is the reception center. And you usually stay there 3 days, where you get processed for uniforms, your shots, and you also have KP. And I knew when I went to that's something I want to avoid in my Army career, for sure, because they wake you up at 4 o'clock in the morning, you get in the kitchen, and you have miserable work to do in the kitchen, and it worked until 8 o'clock at night. I want to avoid that. Well, in my Army career, I did pretty well. I think I only had it 4 times in all the years that I was in the Army, because I always volunteered for guard duty. Even though people always told me, don't volunteer for anything, don't volunteer. I volunteered for guard duty because I wanted to stay away from KP, and I was pretty successful in that. After 3 days, everybody else got orders except me. So I went to the sergeant and said, what's happening with me? I didn't get orders. Let me take a look. He came back, he said, well, you're an enemy alien. I never heard that term before. Enemy alien. I said, sure. You were born in Germany. Your last passport was German. You spoke German. You were schooled in Germany. And Germany's our enemy. You're an enemy alien. The FBI has to investigate you. How long am I going to stay here? He said, I have no idea, but it'll be a while. And I thought right away, oh my God, KP, all this time that I'm going to be staying here? I said, Sergeant, I need to tell you, I know a little bit about the Army. I was in high school ROTC. I had one college course in ROTC in college, and I know the close order drill, I know the weapons, I know some of the tactics, and I know what the Army is supposed to do. He said, great. He said, that's nice to know. I'll make you a acting gadget. What's an acting gadget? I said, I'll show you. He gave me an armband, and I put the armband on, and it had corporal stripes. I was a corporal after 4 days in the Army. Well, not really. I was an acting corporal. I certainly wasn't getting paid as a corporal. But he said, what your mission is, when these new recruits come in, recruits 4 days after me, when you form them up and you march them to the movies, and there they have to see 2 movies, as I did, and then you march them back, and that's going to be your job while you're here at Fort Dix. I said, fine, I'll do that. And sure enough, did. I marched them to the movies, and there were 2 movies that had to be seen. One was a very good film, Why We Fight, a little propaganda film, but it was very well done, Why We Fight. And the other one was How to Avoid Venereal Diseases. Well, as far as the Army goes, I think I had a record of seeing that film more than anybody else in the United States Army. I was there for 3 months, marching troops back and forth. Anyway, I finally got my orders to basic training. Now, it was a strange basic training class because it happened to be with all people who had started college. And after basic training, they were going to go back to college to get a college degree, and they'd become officers. Well, it was a little bit ridiculous because for me to get a college degree, it would be 1946, which was about a year after the war was ended. Well, of course, they didn't know that at the time, but still, it wasn't that they needed officers that badly. And somebody before we graduated figured that out and said, no, we need infantry more than we need college graduates. While in basic training, maybe about 3 weeks after it, I was in there. They took me to Columbus, Georgia, to the Middle District Court of Georgia, where I was sworn in as a U.S. citizen. And I was proud of that because now I was no longer an enemy alien. I was a citizen just like everybody else. And I patted myself on the back because nobody else was going to do it. There was nobody there to do it. Anyway, I felt so much better, and I didn't feel awkward anymore. After the basic training was over, sure enough, we went to the infantry. I went to the 87th Infantry Division, and in that division, we had advanced infantry training. And one time, there was a class on gas attack because the Germans used gas in the First World War, and we weren't going to be caught short. So I was on a demonstration team. I had my gas mask on, and the instructor wanted to make it more realistic, so he drew a grenade, and he threw the grenade. He thought it was smoke. It ended up being white phosphorus. It burned. Well, he got it all smack in his face. He didn't have a gas mask. Luckily, I had my mask, and it hit me around the ears and on the ears and on my hands, on my wrists. My backpack caught fire, and I took off to the dispensary. They didn't know at first what it was until the instructor came in, and he recognized what had happened, and he told them white phosphorus. So they put my hands into a bucket of cold water and applied cold compresses over my ears. Well, I had gotten rid of my pack that had caught fire, and I was in a hospital for a month. And sure enough, when they were assessed replacements to leave to fill the slots that were opened up because of the invasion, they needed infantry, so I became an infantry replacement and left the 87th Division and went into the replacement stream. And we stayed in England for easily 3 weeks, maybe more. And there was nothing to do, you know. We went in the evening, we found some girls where they had a dance, and we had cigarettes that paid for everything. We didn't have money, but we had cigarettes and things like that. So, and then we went to France, the same thing. We went to France, we went over the beaches that had been in the invasion, and all the equipment that was lost during the invasion was still strewed around those beaches. You could see it. But when we came on a Liberty boat, and then we had to transfer in mid-channel onto a assault boat to get closer to the beach, and then by then they had built a little dock, so we never got our feet wet. We went from the assault boat onto the dock, and we went then on a train, and it was a slow ride through France. And the train stopped, and sometimes they told us we got some time to run into town. And we took our rations, we ran into town and bartered and got some bread and cheese and eggs, some whatever we could get. That was better than the rations that we had. But the railroaders were very nice to us, and they whistled, and then we had to really run back to get back on our, well, these were freight cars, the same type of boxcar that was used for the Jews moving into concentration camps. But we weren't packed like sardines, and we had open doors, so it was a different trip, even though it wasn't that comfortable. Anyway, we got into Belgium, to the front lines, and I didn't get orders. And then finally I found out why. When I was in England, they had interviewed everybody, and they found out I had spoken German. And they needed German linguists more than they needed infantry. So I was slated to get orders to go back to Le Vessenay near Paris for a 2-week course in intelligence. If I had been in a regular basic training course, they would have found out that I spoke German, and I would have gone to Camp Ritchie and become a Ritchie boy. Some people have heard of that. These were all German linguists, many of them refugees like me, others who learned German at home, but they were all German linguists, and because of their language capability, they gave them an 8-week course in intelligence, and they became intelligence agents. And as intelligence agents, they wore no rank, even though they were enlisted, or some were officers, but all of them were U.S., and U.S. on a hat, and no rank. And they had their credentials as intelligence agents. Well, now, I went back to Le Vessenay, and that was a 2-week course. And after 1 week, I was needed so badly that they pulled me out. So I had 1 week of training, and I became a full-fledged intelligence agent, well-trained, U.S., no rank. And I joined a 6-man team, 2 officers, 2 linguists, a driver, and a non-commissioned officer in charge. Now, the driver and the non-commissioned officer wore their rank. The driver was a T5, which outranked me because I was still just a PFC. But he didn't know what my rank was, and I always ordered him around because he didn't know he outranked me. Anyway, this was a 6-man team. Then we went immediately to Luxembourg, where 12th Army Group headquarters was. That was General Bradley, right under General Eisenhower. And this was Bradley's headquarters, and we were placed in we were attached to an intelligence unit called T-Force. T-Force was Task Force, 12th Army Group. So the directions for the unit came right from Bradley and his staff. And we went back into Belgium. And we hit Belgium on right at the beginning of December 1944. And on the 15th or 16th of December, the Battle of the Bulge broke out. The first night was the scariest night in my life. Not that we were bombarded or anything or shot at. It was all the rumors that were coming in. The rumors were that there were parachutists all around us, Germans, and that you could hear shooting all the way around. Why they were shooting, no idea. They weren't shooting at anything, they were just shooting because they thought they saw something. And I was placed on a access road, a little dirt road where vehicles came through, and I was given a rifle and ammunition, of course, and a flashlight, and orders: don't let any Germans come in. Those were my orders. I get in the middle of the road, it's dark now, and the first vehicle comes. I say, halt, halt. I says, what are you doing there? I said, I'm making sure you're not a German. He said, if I was a German, you'd be dead. Get in the ditch over there. I thought he had a point. I got into the ditch, and I yell, halt, halt, halt at the next vehicle. He doesn't hear me. Goes right through. I'm not doing my job. I don't know what the hell to do. Nobody tells me anything. No help. And the rumors coming in, the parachutists are right down the road. They might get them any minute. I was flabbergasted. I was all huffed up, and I was scared as heck. Well, at about midnight, they pulled me back, and we had a blackout move towards Antwerp. We didn't know that Antwerp really was the target of the Germans for that bulge, because Antwerp was a post, or was a what do you call it, a port, and they could get all their goodies through there. So that was their aim, to get that port. But they never reached it, and we didn't either. We got to Namur, and in Namur we received orders as to what we were supposed to do during that bulge. And it was, there had been Germans, 4 in a Jeep, had penetrated our lines, and they were in American uniforms, and they were apparently doing some harm in back of our lines, blowing things up, switching signs around, and doing other damage. And those were our targets. And we were to make routes throughout Belgium to see if we could intercept any of them, and listen to people along the way if they had seen anybody like that. And that was our job. Well, it seems like an easy enough job. But when you say Battle of the Bulge, the one thing that comes to my mind immediately was the weather. The weather was just miserable. It was either snowing or sleeting or freezing rain or dusting of moisture. But once you got wet, you stayed wet. Once your feet got wet, they never got dry. And you were in a Jeep with the windshield down, because you couldn't shoot through a windshield. And the wind, even going 25 miles an hour, was absolutely miserable with that moisture. And luckily I was a PFC, because as a PFC I was in the back seat. And the captain was in front of me, and I ducked behind the captain, and he got the worst of it, but I still got plenty of it. But he never knew that he helped me. I never told him. Anyway, the misery was for at least 7 days of this miserable weather. And around Christmas time, suddenly the weather cleared up. The sun started to shine, and our planes started to come over. And we were happy. We were applauding the planes, and we were yelling at them because they couldn't hear us, but it didn't matter. We knew that would turn the tide of the battle, and it did. But it lasted a little bit longer, but our mission was over. And we went into a small town, Vieux-Valef, into a castle there. Well, if you ever are told that you're going to sleep in a castle, turn them down, because these are all cement floors, and even with an air mattress, you couldn't get comfortable on a floor in a castle. It was near Liège. But the Belgian people were very kind, and they invited us in. They gave us a bedroom with a nice feather bed. It was nice and warm, and that made it pleasant. And we could go to Liège for rest and recuperation, R&R leave. And I went into a shower, my first shower in God knows how long, and I stayed in that shower for 20 minutes, and people were yelling, "Get the heck out of there," and I wouldn't move. Anyway, to this day, every day, I not even don't even take a shower. I take a bath. And I remember the Battle of the Bulge every time I take a bath. That never left my mind. And we were there until we started to move into Germany. Now, we had been in Germany. They had taken Aachen at the border, but they were chased out of Aachen. We were chased out of Aachen when the Bulge came. And here the Bulge was ending, and we had recaptured Aachen, and the first city that we were going to go in was Cologne, and it was ready to go into Cologne. Well, what were we going to do in Cologne? We had dossiers of building targets and personality targets. Building targets was anything that was going to be of use to the occupying force, us. That could be a military installation or a utility like a gas company, an electric company, a phone company. All that was useful for us. And then anything that was useful in the prosecution of war criminals. So we would go into government headquarters, Nazi party headquarters, military SS headquarters and installations and things of that sort. All that was target in dossiers that we had. These were all missions for all the big cities as they were being captured. And we had specific cities in our route, and others had other cities, but it was all well documented. So Cologne was our first city, and we saw the cathedral in the distance, and it looked like it was in good shape. And when we got there, we could see damage, but it was still standing. And next to it, there had been a hotel that had been plowed, and it was devastated. And there were some trucks in front, and they had removed the rubble and gotten into the basement, and there was a wine cellar there. And our sergeant said, "Oh, I'll do this." And he poured out the water from his can and went right down in the cellar and filled it up with wine. Well, he was sorry a few days later because we had run out of water, and washing with wine was not a good way to go. And he in his Jeep, and we were in the other Jeep, but his Jeep ran a leak, and he couldn't use the wine to fill the radiator, and it was a mess. And the first chance he got is he poured the wine out and put water back in. He learned that lesson. Well, anyway, we had really better business than getting the darn wine. And one of our first party targets was a German concern, which was laying right at the Rhine River. And the Rhine divided us from the Germans because when they saw us coming, they evacuated to the other side of the Rhine and blew the bridges. Well, so we knew the Germans were on the other side, so we were careful, and we pulled behind the building, and we went into the German concern, and you could see the Germans had evacuated quickly. They had strewn all kinds of stuff in the hallways. We went upstairs, and we found a living thing. What was it? Canary bird. And we were admiring the canary bird. We wanted to see if he needed any food or water, but the Germans had adequately given him all that. And the bird seemed to be happy to see somebody too. And as we were admiring each other, suddenly a mortar round came, and they had seen the Jeep, and it was over. And we ran like heck, got into the Jeep and started it. The second round fell, and luckily it was short. And that's how the targeting is usually: one over, one short, and fire for effect. Sure enough, the third round was right where the Jeep had been parked, but we were off. Well, this, of course, gave me a different perspective about the war, because they were trying to kill me. It was very impersonal before. There was artillery fire and so forth, but it was just aimed at everybody, not me. This one was meant for me. And I was very respectful about enemy fire from then on. That wasn't going to happen again. Aside from our dossiers, and our personality targets were not at all available in Cologne because all the Nazis had vacated to the other side of the Rhine. They were on the other side. We weren't going to find anybody. Because we had more time, we were asked to help in enforcing the curfew. So the driver and I went out in the dark because there were not supposed to be any Germans on the streets after dark. And we saw a figure running in the distance, and I said, give chase. And he actually got the person cornered, and I found out it was a young girl. And I asked her in German, and she was flabbergasted. The American is speaking in German. That happens all the time. Everybody got flabbergasted when I spoke German too. Anyway, she said, "I'm getting food because we're starving." I said, "What do you mean we are starving?" She said, "Well, I'm living with a Dutch lady, and there's another girl, and we had one ration card, and all the rations were gone when the Germans evacuated to the other side of the river. There were only about 1/3 of the population of Cologne on our western side of the river, and we were always supplementing our ration with the black market, and the black market disappeared too when you came through." So I said, "Hey, now wait a second. What do you mean one ration card?" And she was hemming and hawing, and then finally said, "Well, you see, this British lady took us in. We two girls were Jewish. I almost fell out of the Jeep. I said, how could you sustain yourself? She said, well, because the Dutch lady protected us. And she hid us in her house. I said, get in the Jeep. I validated everything she said. I had some rations in the car, in the Jeep. I gave them the rations, and they immediately opened up and started to eat because they were really hungry. The Dutch lady explained that they hadn't had anything for 3 days after the Germans had left when we were approaching. And she even explained another thing. She said, but, I'm so happy you Americans are here because I have cancer. And I didn't know what would happen to the girls if I were to die because they would be exposed and they would be taken in and probably wouldn't survive. And, well, that really impacted on me. I said, well, don't worry about the food. We'll take care of you. I went back to a lieutenant in the headquarters and told him about this British lady and the two Jewish girls. He said, I'll take care of them. Well, about 3 days later, I had time, and my other interpreter, I had told him about it. His name was Flo, and we went to the house. I wanted to introduce him to these people, and there's a big off-limits sign. Off-limits? Well, off-limits meant you can't go past it. So we didn't. We went back to the headquarters, and I saw the lieutenant. I said, what the heck? Why do you put an off-limits sign there? He said, I don't know what you're talking about. I have no idea. Let's take a ride. And he hopped in our Jeep. We went back to the house, and of course, we went past the off-limits sign now with the officer. And we get greeted by the Dutch lady, and the girls fall all over us. We were their liberators. And the lieutenant says to the Dutch lady, well, what's with the off-limits sign? And the Dutch lady chuckles and says, you did too good a job. I said, what do you mean I did too good a job? Well, she said, you sent this 2.5-ton truck with rations, and I put them in the basement, and the truck leaves, and pretty soon another truck comes with rations, and we put them in the basement. Then another truck, and another truck, and another truck, and I didn't know what to do with the rations. The basement is full of rations. I went to, there was an American unit that had moved in next door practically, down the block. And I went there, and I saw this captain who commanded it, and I told him about my problem. He said, no sweat, I'll take care of it. And that's how we got the off-limits sign. Oh, it was a lovely story of how a Dutch lady saved these two girls and how the Americans, when they heard, they wanted to help and send rations. Too many. The next city on our list was Düsseldorf. Düsseldorf was on the other side of the Rhine in the Saar Valley, which was all industrialized. And we went over the Remagen Bridge, the bridge that was captured by a armored unit that came, and it stayed for about 17 days until it fell into the river. But by then, the engineers had built another small bridge, so there was never any interruption. But we went over the actual Remagen Bridge still, and that was quite a operation because you go into a holding area, and then slowly, one after another, unit was told you're ready to go across the bridge, and was all monitored. We interchanged with CID agents and other trained and CIC agents, trained personnel who knew about certain things. And but one thing we didn't know was whether we could get into Düsseldorf, whether it's been captured or not, because the information wasn't flowing right. There was utter confusion. So Flo and I were told, make a recon and see if we can move into Düsseldorf. So we start to drive there, and we came to a place where we could see the houses in the distance, and we could see they all had white towels, white sheets, trying to give up, I guess. And we went a little bit closer, and we saw there was a roadblock across the road we were on, and we saw a lot of people running around. We watched them, and we noticed they weren't putting stuff on the roadblock. They were trying to take the stuff away from the roadblock. They were trying to open it up, and there was an open area already. So we approached, and as they saw us, they all ran off into their own houses. And we got through the crack of the roadblock and damaged the tire. So we limped into an Esso station that conveniently was right there. And I went back and got the German owner and asked him if he can switch tires from our spare and switch it with the damaged one. Said, I can take care of it. He too was amazed. Americans are speaking German. I said, have you seen any Americans yet? No, you're the first ones. I thought, oh, goodness. No, he switched the tires. I gave him a pack of cigarettes, and we said, hey, this is not our job to liberate Düsseldorf. We better go back and tell them to wait a day or so, and we did. And, of course, other units from different directions might have already been in Düsseldorf, but we figured we were the liberators of Düsseldorf. The first priority target we had was the organization called Stahlhof. Stahlhof was an international conglomerate bigger than U.S. Steel. And I was teamed up with a CIC officer who had a college degree in economics. So it made sense to team up like that with people who understood what they were talking about. And we got to the building, and it was partially damaged, but it was still manageable. It wasn't completely torn off. And we found a janitor in the building, and I asked him, can you get some directors? Are you in contact with any? He said, yeah, I can get you 5 or 6 directors. I said, we'll be back this afternoon and have the directors here. Came back, and the directors met us and led us up to one floor up where they had a boardroom, none damaged, beautiful, beautiful furniture, large table, 2 chairs in the front, and on the side, the directors sit down on the side and leave the 2 front tables for us. They offered us cigars. The CIA agent took one, and I declined. Smartest thing I did that, because I would have choked to death. I was 19 years old. I had never had a cigar in my life. And I wasn't even smoking cigarettes, come to think of it. Well, anyway, we started conversations, and I could tell right away that this was way over my head. This guy was using terminology in economics that I didn't really know what it was, and I didn't know it in German either, because I had a 7th grade education in Germany. So this is when I found out my education was completely inadequate, not just the 1 week of intelligence, but also my college degree was missing. And I knew when I get back home, I had to get back and get myself a college degree. It really sank in right then and there. I felt completely inadequate. But I was able to limp along and tell them, well, we want an inventory of all your assets in 48 hours. And they said, well, to get you an accurate one, it would take us 6 months. We said, no, get whether you can, 48 hours, and we'll go from there. And we came back, and sure enough, they had it. and we sent it back. Well, I never got to see any of the dossiers because I was never the one in charge. I was the lowest ranking one. But he had enough, and he told me he was going to send it back to tell him that this one really has to be exploited with further context by military government as soon as possible, because they were all over the place. Next one was a small one, Ziegen, a small, not small, I mean, it was still a city, and an industrial one, but I don't remember the what we had there, except there was a disturbance when we moved in, and we could hear some woman screeching, and there was fighting words between people, men that were exchanging words. And we got closer, and we found out it was a Polish laborer, forced laborer, who had come out of his forced labor camp, and he had confronted this German who had his family with him, a wife and two kids, and he had his rifle aimed at the German and said he was a guard at our labor camp, and he's going to kill him. And the German was saying, no, 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 I never was a guard any place. I'm a railroader. So I asked him, well, have you got your railroad identification cards? Because they all had IDs. And he said, no, I left at home. Well, I was suspicious. He was probably one of the guards. But he wasn't on our list. So he was not in my jurisdiction that way. And all my only interest was to keep order. So we talked to the Polish guy. We talked him out of the rifle. I gave him a pack of cigarettes, as usual, and he was happy with that. And he walked off. And the Germans were profusely thankful, but we waved them off. We didn't want anything to do with them, and they took off. Were saved, but. Later on, I thought, did I do the right thing? And then I said, yeah, I did the right thing, because I always said we were not going to be like them. We were going to do it correctly by the Geneva Conventions, and we're going to not take our revenge on these people. We're just going to do what we're supposed to do. So I was happy with what I did. The next one was a big one, Frankfurt. Frankfurt was going to be the supreme headquarters for the U.S. forces in Germany. And there was an IG Farben building that was one of our first priority targets that was protected from air attack because that was going to be Eisenhower's headquarters. And they didn't want to damage that headquarters. It was our first priority target, but when we came in, we had selected a place next to the railroad station as our headquarters building because it was a hotel that wasn't completely demolished, and we used it as an interrogation center. And there was an immediate problem at hand. They had captured a lot of officers, and they needed an immediate decision whether any of them needed further interrogation for tactical reasons or whether they can just be put in a POW camp. So we had to wait before we did our mission to screen these in the hotel. And I screened a number of officers. Most of them were into the POW camp. No need for further fill-up. And I get one, a major general. Now here I'm sitting as a PFC, and he's standing at attention in front of me, and I'm living this thing up. This is the way I knew that's the way the war was supposed to go. So I was very happy with all these officers who came at attention, and here now this major general. I said, what's your name? And he says, August Wilhelm von Hohenzollern. I said, whoa. I knew who I had in front of me because I had gotten that in my German education. The von Hohenzollerns were the Kaiser. That was the aristocracy. This one, August Wilhelm, was Prince Auwi. He was the son of the Kaiser. I immediately ran to the captain. I said, I got a big one. He said, who you got? I said, I got the son of the Kaiser. Oh my God. Okay. That was the end of my discussion with Prince Auwi. They took him away, and I never knew what happened after that. Now, one other thing happened, and we still not getting our first priority target. Somebody comes running in and said, stop everything, come out and move the vehicles from in front of the railroad station because we just found a huge unexploded bomb in the railroad station, and we got to move the vehicles. My sergeant tells me, go move that Jeep. And I said, I don't know how to drive. Now let me translate what he said at that point. He said, would you take that nice little vehicle down there to that wonderful location around the block and place it in a park position very gently there? I knew what he was talking about, and I jumped in the Jeep, and it was like riding a horse that hadn't been ridden before, because while I saw how people were driving between the clutch and the gear shift, I never tried it. And this was the first time I tried it. And it sure didn't work the way I thought it might work. But I don't know how I finally got that Jeep into that nice place that the sergeant wanted me to park the Jeep. And then I ran back, and they took care of the bomb. It never exploded. And we were able to move out finally and get our first priority target. But the delay was a costly one, because when we hit the IG Farben building, an infantry unit had a lot of forced laborers that had been freed on his hands, and he didn't know what to do with them, so he put them into the IG Farben building. Well, they were, of course, raving mad against the Germans, and they took their anger out by smashing all the windows, taking all the furniture, throwing it out of the window, and it was a mess on the outside. We could see it as we approached the building, and we said, God, there goes the headquarters. They had about $1 million worth of damage that had to be repaired before Eisenhower could take over in that. We had an EOD team, explosive ordnance detachment, that was going to blow up the safes, blow them open. And they did, and we found a lot of documents there. Now, we didn't examine them, but IG Farben was responsible for the poison gas that was used in concentration camps to kill the people in the camps. And we secured all the documents and sent them back for further examination. We weren't going to do that. And then there were industrial diamonds. And the EOD team, they took the industrial diamonds for whatever they were going to use them for. And then there were stacks of money, German marks. And we took the stacks of German money. We thought that was not worth anything. And we took it back to the people who didn't have a chance to go out so they could have some souvenirs. So we gave these stacks to the people in headquarters as souvenirs. I must have given away thousands of dollars, because those money, that a mark was worth 1/4 of its worth in real money. And we didn't know it. When the word doesn't get down to the troops, that's what happens. We gave away all that from the safes in the IG Farben building. The next town was Wiesbaden, and Wiesbaden, we liberated a Russian labor camp. And the problem there was half of the people there were forced laborers, and half of them were Ukrainians who had volunteered to help the Germans because they hated the Russians. So we thought we might have to separate those two, but it was an impossibility because everybody was pointing fingers at everybody else, and we couldn't find out in the broken German that they had who was lying and who was not lying. And finally we decided this is hopeless. We'll just consider them all as forced laborers and treat them that way. As we were driving towards Kassel, we could see the war was over because on both sides of the Autobahn, the Germans came slowing towards us with their hands up. They all wanted to be taken prisoner. Mainly they wanted to eat, and anything to eat. When we got to Kassel, we got orders, forget about Kassel, ignore it, go immediately to Magdeburg, because Magdeburg, the Russians were on the other side of the Elbe. Now, the Elbe River was the delineation line that General Eisenhower maintained to keep the Soviet and U.S. and British and French forces apart from each other, because he was afraid that if there was an intermingling, we might have some incidents. And it was a wise decision, although General Patton was very unhappy because Berlin was on the other side of the Elbe, and he wanted to get to Berlin. We got to Magdeburg, and sure enough, we heard the Russians were on the other side, and all the bridges were blown. And the captain got a top-secret map that showed the occupation zones. And the occupation zones clearly showed that Magdeburg and areas even further west all the way to Helmstedt were part of the Soviet zone. So the Russians were going to get that territory that we were on. And I figured out what the mission of the captain was, even though he didn't explain it. He was to take the map across, show the Russians, and tell them, yes, that's your zone, but stay where you are until we pull back in 2 or 3 months from now, and then you go ahead and occupy it. But not now. Stay where you are. Well, he's looking for a Russian interpreter. Can't find one. He turns to me. He says, "You're my interpreter. Come with me." I'm trying to get out of this. I said, "Captain, I can't help you. I don't speak any Russians. I know one word, tovarish, friend. That's it." He said, "I don't care. Carry the map." So he and I, we get a German boatman to take us across, and in the middle of the river, he stands up to make sure the Russian sees an American coming across. And when you get to the other side, you can't imagine the reception we received. They hugged us, they kissed us, they carried us around, they tried to plow us with vodka. I'm 19 years old, never had a glass of vodka in my life. I took one sip and I knew that this is not stuff that I better drink. But I had some cigarettes to reciprocate, but of course I was of absolutely no use. They spoke nothing but Russian, and they took the captain to their rear where they must have found an interpreter. I stayed at the river's edge, and I'm trying to communicate with the Russians. And one NCO came over and said, "Me, Moscow." I said, "Me, New York." And he said, "Me, come Moscow." I said, "You, come New York." That's how we were talking. Anyway, we got back. The captain came back. He was happy. He must have found a way to communicate with them. And they had the map. And we got the boatman to take us back. And we told we had a nice reception and then forgot about it. Well, it was months later, in the middle of the night, how you sometimes wake up with a brilliant idea. Well, a brilliant idea came into my mind. Why did we have such a wonderful reception? When the Germans moved into Russia in the beginning of the war, they mistreated the Russians. And the Russians, when the war shifted around, were taking their revenge. So the Germans didn't want to be taken prisoner by the Russians because they were afraid what was going to happen to them. So they fought every inch of the way because they didn't want to be taken prisoner. And the Russians, therefore, had to fight their way all the way up to the Elbe. So when they finally saw an American in American uniform coming towards them, they recognized there were no more Germans in front of them. They had survived the war, and they were celebrating their survival. That's why we got this kind of reception. And do you know that many years later, a friend of mine who had been a Soviet liaison officer, American Soviet liaison officer, he was American, he said, you met the Russians, didn't you, at the Elbe? I said, yes. And he said, well, there is a ceremony in Arlington National Cemetery, which you probably don't know about, and most people don't know about, but they have a marker there, and the Russian ambassador holds a ceremony at the marker every year on the 25th of April, the day the Russians and Americans met at Torgau at the Elbe. I said, well, I wasn't at Torgau. He said, you were at Magdeburg, that's good enough work. Come and see see what we're doing. And I did, and they had big reefs coming from all the former Soviet republics, which are now separate nations and still were in speaking terms with the Russians. They all brought a reef, and here we were, some American veterans, and we brought a little flower to put on the marker. And I thought this was awkward. We should have a reef. I mean, there were two that met, and we didn't have any representation. So I wrote Senator Warner, the old Senator Warner, not the present one. And I told him about it, and he wrote back and said, yeah, I'll have to let DOD know, and so forth. And then the next year, it was going to be a big celebration, the 60th anniversary, and I was hoping the Americans would bring something, and we would maybe invited to the Soviet embassy for a reception. Well, I was invited to go to Moscow to celebrate the celebration of Soviet and U.S. forces at the Elbe in Moscow. Everything paid. And I did. And I was invited every 5 years after that, 3 more times. The fourth times were with a virus. We didn't have that. But just because I went with the captain to the other side of the Elbe, I was invited to go to Moscow, a mission that I wanted to get out of at the time. But anyway, just to tell you about the reefs. The next time I went there, they had a officer from the protocol office in uniform, but no reef. And of course, he was more or less ignored with all the other dignitaries around there. So I said, the heck with it. I bought a reef the following time. But of course, mine was a much smaller reef than there. I couldn't afford their reef. So when they see me with my reef, I'm the first one to be placed there. And the other reefs came next. And then the last one was the ambassadors, right at the marker. But mine was right next to the marker. So they did appreciate it. We were in Magdeburg when VE Day occurred. We had taken care of all the dossiers. We had arrested a number of people in Magdeburg because they really couldn't go much further. And when VA Day came, it was anticlimactical. We couldn't care less. Nobody made any notice of it. And just another day that passed. Oh, yeah, the war's over. But then we got orders, moved back to Wiesbaden, and our detachment was evaporated. It was inactivated. And so was T4's 12th Army Group. And 12th Army Group was also being dissolved. And we were all getting different assignments. I was assigned to the Military Intelligence Center at Obersursel near Frankfurt as a document agent, which title that I didn't like much. But now I was no longer an agent. I now had to put my stripes on, but luckily I didn't have to put my one stripe as PFC on, because somewhere along the line I had been promoted to T5, and I had to put the corporal insignia with a T. So I wasn't really a non-commissioned officer. I was just a specialist. I didn't have a job at first, and then the chief of documents at CHAPE headquarters asked for me to report to him. And he started to question me, and he said, you know, we have a mission of sending back all these sensitive documents, they're all secret or top secret, to go back to the States for examination to be used in the coming trials of these German war criminals. And I want you to go to Fechenheim, which was on the other side of Frankfurt, and there you'll have a squad of German POWs, and you will supervise those Germans to get those documents securely placed into wooden crates that they will have to construct, and then you'll mark these crates, the top secret documents, and then we'll take them off your hands for shipment back to the States. Can you handle a job? I said, sure. And he said, it's a job that requires the rank of staff sergeant. I said, I'll be happy to take that job. And I took the job. I found my squad of POWs. It was the German POW by the name of Kaufmann, the sergeant who was in charge of the POWs, and I gave him the instructions, and he told these Germans what to do. And I got the documents. I made sure nobody touched them beyond, in bulk, putting them into these crates. They manufactured the crates, and when they sealed them shut, then I put the top secret document notice on top, and somebody came and picked them up. So it worked very well. And every month I got a promotion. I went from T5 to corporal. I was now a non-commissioned officer. And then I went to T4, again, a technician I didn't like. But then the sergeant, I was fine. Now I became sergeant of the guard back in Obersursel, in charge of the guard force that was guarding the outer perimeter of the German sensitive prisoners that we had at Obersursel. And we didn't know who we had in there. We thought we had Goering, for example. We didn't have Goering because all the people in the first Nuremberg trial, they were in Berlin. We had the people in the second Nuremberg trial, although I found that out many years later. These were concentration camp commanders and deputies of the primary Nazis and so forth. They were tried in the second Nuremberg trial. Some of them were executed also. Anyway, but it was so well done. We never knew who was in there, and we had a tight perimeter, and only special authorized people went past us, and then there was another guard force under a different command that guarded the prisoners themselves. I had gotten to know the chief of documents pretty well, and he gave me, I had to have points enough to go home. Everybody got points. And when my points payment came up 1 year after the war was ended, in May of 1946, I told my chief of documents, I'm ready to go home. He said, let me take care of you. You don't have to go to Camp Lucky Stripes and be in a big glob of unit movements with a troop ship going back. I'm going to give you 2 crates of documents to be delivered to the port of Brooklyn, to the document section there, and you go on a Navy Liberty ship. I got my documents. I went on my Liberty ship, and I was received beautifully. They helped me with the crates, and they took care of me in quarters, beautiful quarters. And I now ate in the NCO mess, and the food was delicious. It was the best food I had all those years that I had been in the Army. I had to wait till I'm ready to be discharged on a Navy ship that I get the best food. And I get to New York, and they helped me get the documents off, and I handed them in and got it signed off. And off I took for a taxi. It's about noontime. I can't get a taxi. Why? Because they're making money on these short runs, at noontime particularly, and I had to go to Manhattan, and they didn't want any part of me. So I had to wait at least 2 hours until I got a taxi driver who took pity on me and said, all right, I'll take you to Manhattan. Well, he took me in. I had my duffel bag, and I'm walking into the building, and all of a sudden a cold feeling came over me. I don't know what it was, but I dumped the duffel bag, and I ran out of the building, and I started to walk around the area. And I started to calm down as I saw all these places that were still there, the candy store, the automobile store, the pizza parlor. And I went to all the way up to where I thought my former girlfriend had lived. I had even named my Jeep after her, Julie. It was funny. In German, Julie is Julia, and that was a terrible name. But my Jeep was Julie. But I didn't go into that building either. Besides, after the war was over, the correspondence cooled down, and we didn't correspond anymore. And I figured she had found somebody else anyway. So I didn't want to do that. But I finally got back to my house, and I was ready to go home, and I rang the bell, and of course my mother was there. She was ecstatic. She had been waiting for me. She didn't know which day I would arrive, but here I was. And then my father came home from work, and he was ecstatic too, and we had a wonderful reunion. And then he found out that I still had my 45. I had liberated a 45 along. It was never an issued weapon. I was one that I found in one of these, well, I don't even remember where I found it, but I found it there, and it was mine. I liberated it, as I had liberated a camera, for example, a Leica. Anyway, and he said, you got to get rid of that. You got to get rid of it. He was all excited. And I didn't want to be excited because I knew he had high blood pressure. So I got one of my friends who I knew, and I gave it to him and said, get rid of this thing for me. He said, I'll take care of it. And I told my father to calm down. I took care of it. Well, 10 days after I arrived, he had a massive heart attack at work. He went to a hospital, and he died the next day. That was my homecoming. And then they had a 52-20 club. What that meant was you received $20 for 52 weeks, every week, without doing anything. But once you start a job or school, it stops. But nobody's going to force you to either go to school or take a job. If you don't do anything for 52 weeks, we'll support you. We owe you that. And I started that, but I knew I had to go to college, and I waited for the college term to start in September. From May to September, I was on the 52-20 club. And then in September, I started college. While I was in high school, a friend of mine who was with me in class, we got together, and after school, there was a junior high school in the block where I lived. The back entrance was on 108th Street, and we went through there to participate in after-school sports, and they had ping pong. And I was, as you remember, almost a ping pong champion once. Well, we played ping pong with two girls, and one was named Ping, and one was named Pong. And my friend liked Ping, I liked Pong. And we played, and I beat Pong, but just barely. She was a very good player. Of course, she would have disputed that she won some too. I never admitted to losing. Anyway, when I was then into the Army, I wrote a lot of girls. Somehow I did not write to Pong. Why, I don't know, because it wasn't that I had just played ping pong. I even took her to a movie a couple of times. But I didn't write. Anyway, when I went back into college, I found she had gone to CCNY like me. I met her there, although she lived just around the block from me. She was 107th Street, I was 108th Street. So I made contact again with her at CCNY, and I started to date her again, and it became serious and more serious and more serious. And finally, I convinced her that we're engaged. But we were secretly engaged because she could not tell her parents she was engaged. Well, her parents, her mother and her two sisters, and she had a brother, but he died in World War II. So there were two sisters and a mother who were absolutely convinced that she was much too young. She was 19, and she was too young to get married. And actually, I couldn't argue that, but I did in a way. And when she was with me, she wore the ring I gave her, and when she was not, she had a necklace, and she was wearing the ring inside. Okay. Well, we went like that for a few months, and she turned 20, and then I became more insistent, and I said we ought to get married. And now it was November 1948, and we couldn't tell anybody. We were going to run off, get married. And I took her, and we got Paul and another friend of mine and his girlfriend. So there were 3 witnesses that were coming with me. And Paula and me, we get on the subway to go downtown where I meet Lieutenant Colonel Ringel, my municipal court judge who was my commander in the reserve. And I said, Judge Ringel, would you marry us? And Ringel sort of chuckled. He said, well, nice try, but a municipal judge doesn't have the authority to marry. I said, oh my God, I never thought of that. What a disaster. And he said, I'm sorry, but that's how it is. So we huddle and Paula's ready to go home. I said, no, 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 we'll do something else. We find a telephone booth with a telephone book. We go down the line, and I find a rabbi in Brooklyn who, after we called, said, yeah, I'll perform the marriage ceremony. Back on the subway to Brooklyn now, and he marries us. And we get home, we get back to Manhattan, and it's still got to be a secret because we don't have any place to go except home. We don't have an apartment, and there's a housing shortage. This is not an easy thing. I got to look for an apartment. Took me 3 weeks that I found a miserable room with a kitchenette and a joint bathroom with another tenant that we could move into. And that's when we finally, I told my mother and she told her mother, we are married and we're moving into this one-room apartment. Well, my mother was aghast that she wasn't invited to the marriage, but she was happy. She knew the girl. She was happy with her. That was the easy part. The hard part was Paula's mother. She was not happy. She was furious. And for a whole day, she wouldn't talk to her. And then the next day she came around and she apparently forgave her. And we were married happily ever after. I recognized that most of the things that happen to you in life are just inconsequential. Don't get yourself involved. Don't get all hysterical. Take it in stride. It comes and it goes. There are just very few things that are important. And you focus on the important things and you forget about all the rest of it. And I recognized what was important and what wasn't. And that made all the difference in the world. The other thing was I took my bath and I remembered the Battle of the Bulge.